As we approach the one-year mark of the Pulse nightclub shooting, many survivors, victims' families, and others in our community are struggling with the horror of what occurred in our city nearly 1 year ago. Today on Central Florida Spotlight, a man who helped many of us in those dark days after the attack, Dwight Bain, the nationally certified counselor and life coach. Hi, folks, and welcome to this week's edition of Central Florida Spotlight. I'm Greg Wormuth, and with me today is Dwight Bain. Dwight is a local counselor with a national reputation for community crisis management, and it's safe to say ours was a community in crisis just about 1 year ago. Dwight, thanks for being back on the show, and again, you came with props. We'll talk about that, but first, if you think about this weekend 1 year ago, this had not happened to us yet.
Right, and so if we go back in time, because I grew up here, you grew up here, we love Orlando, everybody loves Central Florida. So we'll call that old normal. A normal was, it was safe to go downtown. It was safe to walk in a lake at Walt Disney World. It was safe to go to a family concert with your grandma, right? New normal, you go to a concert at the Plaza Theater and a girl gets murdered. New normal, people who are just celebrating a night out get murdered in a club on Orange Avenue next to a Dunkin' Donuts. New normal, a little child gets taken by an alligator. And that happened in the span of 4 days. And so the innocence of Orlando was taken away. And sadly, Greg, it was taken away forever.
So as we were here a year ago today, 1 week out from the Pulse shooting, will we ever get back there again?
No, you can't get back to old normal, but you can build new normal. And new normal is a place of resiliency. It's a place of greater strength. The innocence that was lost, that won't come back. But the new strength that we can get on the other side of a crisis, because everybody deals with crisis. Some people, it's a very personalized crisis. They're in a car wreck, or they have a family member who's involved in a boating accident who drowns, right? It's a sudden crisis. And then can they ever get back to the place? No, something happened. But as we walk through a series of steps, we can get to a place of resiliency and strength. And so new normal is available.
So when you hear the phrase, the good old days, are there ever good old days?
I think that it's easy for people to remember the innocence, the simplicity, but we live in a world that's very complex. So the good old days when there was no traffic on Interstate 4, the good old days when people didn't have to worry about somebody texting and driving. Life is very complex. Life changes very fast. And so it's nice to think that, but in a metropolitan area like Central Florida, we're not going to get back to simplicity, but we can get to a place of strength.
Use the word resiliency, strength. How about happiness?
Happiness, in large part, it's a great question. Happiness, in a large part, depends on what is happening to you at the time. If things are going well, you feel pretty happy. If things aren't going well, you feel very unhappy and maybe sad. And so I would rather guide people toward a deeper emotion called joy. I was listening to a podcast in preparation for our time. There was a young woman who was permanently injured and because of a mistake. And the rest of her life, when she was 19, the rest of her life, she is in a wheelchair. And she said, I didn't get my legs back, but I got my joy back. And even after something catastrophic, you can find a sense of strength inside, resiliency inside. Viktor Frankl, in the book Man's Search for Meaning, talks about this. No matter what is happening to the outside of you, you control what's happening on the inside. We can master our moods.
Okay, so what about the I'm waiting for something bad to happen because we know it can person, because we saw bad happen before our very eyes 1 year ago?
We saw bad things happen, and so when we look at old normal was innocent, you didn't pay much attention to your surroundings if you were in Central Florida. This is a pretty safe place. We love it here. Downtown, a lot of people having fun, but you don't have to worry. New normal means you're paying attention to your surroundings. Now, I'll tell you, Greg, I don't like that. I grew up here. I mean, walking around downtown, doing fun stuff. But Orlando has changed maybe faster than any other city in the country because we've gone from kind of a sleepy small town to one of the most visited cities on the planet in a period of a few decades. So because of that, if I said, we're in Cali, Colombia, you would pay attention to your surroundings. If I said that we're in Lebanon or Syria, you'd pay a little more attention to your surroundings. And now when I say you're in Orlando, you need to pay attention. Just being aware. Does that make me afraid? No, it just means I'm going to be aware of my surroundings. If I'm out boating with my family, I'm going to pay attention to alligators. And before, people didn't think about that much. If I'm at a family event, I might be paying attention to the person standing in the back with a backpack by himself, not listening to the music. We're having to pay more attention to things because our part of the world has changed, just like many other parts of the world. But we can still enjoy a good quality of lifestyle. We just can't do it with our heads in the sand.
A wake-up call is that phrase.
It was a wake-up call that none of us wanted, but once you're awake, you can't unsee things, and you can actually go forward in strength.
All right, good. We're going to continue our discussion with Dwight Bain. We'll discuss some strategies for people struggling emotionally as we approach the one-year mark since the deadliest mass shooting in recent U.S. history. Of course, it happened here in Orlando at Pulse. Join us after the break. Well, welcome back to Spotlight, here again with nationally certified counselor Dwight Bain. We want to thank him for sharing his advice and suggestions on ways to cope with the grief we all really still feel in the aftermath of the Pulse nightclub attack. What are those mostly directed, affected by the attack feeling now? Survivors, victims, family?
Yeah, I drove through a part of downtown Orlando to our interview today because I wanted to remember what it felt like a year ago. I wanted to remember the feelings of the victims. So you have 49 people murdered, 53 permanently injured, hundreds who were there that night. And so when we look at that, when you hit a one-year anniversary, the brain will replay things. I remember where I was. Do you remember the phone call? Do you remember we walked in with him, but we didn't walk out? And so it's very normal at a one-year anniversary. And for many people, here's the trauma of the event. The trauma of remembering at the one-year anniversary frequently will match the same level of trauma. That's why it's very important for us to pay attention to signs and symptoms, not just for those that lost a loved one, but for those who lost a friend, for those who heard about it, for those who were kind of shell-shocked. And remember, because at Christina Grimmie's funeral, her mom said, "Don't let people forget my daughter." There were 3 tragedies a year ago. And I want to remember the parents who've lost a child, whether it's to an alligator attack, or the parents who've lost a child in a mass shooting, or the parents who've lost a child because of a stalker. Anybody who's gone through that kind of pain, Greg, will start to feel some of this a year later.
Right now, I want to talk to you about our community as a whole. How do you think we came out of this? How are we doing 1 year later?
That's a great question, and I've been thinking about that a lot as I've been watching the markers, because when you look at some communities after a mass shooting, we'll see a big spike in domestic violence, or a big spike in substance abuse, a big spike in suicide. And what I've been seeing in Central Florida, in some ways, has shocked me, because I've seen a big spike in community. People coming together to be able to say, you know what, you're my neighbor. We didn't really talk before, but how can I help you? You know what, I never really thought about that part of Central Florida, but what can we do? Greg, we've seen rallies and prayer vigils. I've seen things here, and I've worked around crisis events for 30 years. I've seen things here, not just one time, but then the next week, and then the next week, and then the next week, and I've spoken at a number of events and met new friends, and what I'm seeing is a ripple effect of community. People who share common values, and how can I help you? And so right now I'm looking at Central Florida thinking that I didn't want to be the part of the country that had the highest mass shooting in history, but now we're the part of the country, I think, that's modeling community, common values, coming together, saying, how can we support each other?
My recollection of the events, the one that burns into my brain, is the lines around One Blood with people wanting to donate.
That's right. I'd forgotten about that. But when you look at that, people wanting to donate, people bringing bottled water, and not just for a day or two, people being engaged and involved week after week after week. And now that we're coming to the 1 year anniversary, there's an opportunity for people to say, you know, what have we done for that coworker who lost a friend or a family member or a loved one? And let me also be quick to say, what are we doing for the first responders? Because many of them saw things that they were not prepared for. Nobody in any city in the country has experienced this.
Mayor Dyer sat in that chair just a few weeks ago on Spotlight and said that some of those 911 operators and some of the responders were at the Gray shooting, and then also at the Pulse shooting, and also dealt with the alligator attack.
Right. And then so our emergency services just stretched paper thin. So if you think, what have I done for a first responder? What have I done? And maybe you don't know if they worked one of those disasters, one of those critical incidents, but you know that they're a police officer, they're a firefighter, you know that they're a 911 operator. Sometimes just to say, you are not in this alone. I want you to know we've got your back. We're here as a support system for you, can make all the difference in the world, because they're not used to hearing thank you for all the things that you do.
So we're going to talk about, we don't want to ignore your other guest here. Coming up in our next segment, Dwight, we're going to talk about how you can tell the difference between PTSD, PTG, and also what are some of those warning signs and how can we get past it? How can we heal? We've got a lot more to talk about. Resiliency, that's the word of the day here on Central Florida Spotlight with this counselor who's an expert, unfortunately, in this field that is, again, dealing with disasters like we had here in Central Florida. Back with Dwight Bain next. Well, welcome back to Central Florida Spotlight. Again, 1 week from basically today, Orlando changed forever with the Pulse shooting. To talk about that, world-renowned, really, grief counselor Dwight Bain, who has gone all over the country dealing with people that have had to deal with disasters and crisis, and this one happens in your own backyard.
No. It was tragic, and yet I remember something that Sheriff Demings told me many years ago. He said, we've got to stay prepared because what if the big one happens here? And nobody wanted that. Nobody expected that. But I know this. Crisis happens. I can't control that. But I can control how I respond to it. And that's the process of resiliency. That's what we're talking about today.
For those who have been in Central Florida for some time, they remember the William Cruz shooting at the Winn-Dixie in Palm Bay.
Yeah.
That was your first response to a mass shooting and dealing with the psychological impacts of
That's
that.
right. That was my trial by fire because, of course, Palm Bay, about an hour drive from Orlando, and nobody either wanted to go, knew what to do, knew what to say, and I just said, I'll go help. I'd had one class in graduate school on crisis management, one class. But I said, I've had a little bit of training, I'll go help. And I remember being in the parking lot of that Winn-Dixie and talking to people, and here's, ambulance drivers and paramedics. And that led to an extensive amount of training because I wanted to be better equipped for the next disasters.
It's your life's work now. We have another guest here because this happens to someone's brain with PTSD when there's a crisis event. It's not because they're weak. It is actually a physiological thing that happens inside.
That's exactly right. And so, this is just a model of what's happening. Something traumatic happens and a person reacts psychologically. Abnormal thing like a shooting. The normal reaction is this part of the brain, right here, the prefrontal cortex, will freeze. Person can't think. Executive function, the ability sometimes to remember their name and their phone number. Remember in the old, Rocky Balboa boxing movies, the referee would say, what city are you in? What's your name? And back then they didn't know. But when we get traumatized, this part of our brain stops working. It's because of cortisol that's coming right out of the pituitary gland. And when we feel so traumatized, whether you're 6 years old or 60, it's hard to think and concentrate. That's why we need people around us to even say basic things. Are you okay? How can I help you? Can I get you something to drink? Just a glass of water. That brain freeze, very temporary and very normal, but it's not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of trauma. And if you don't deal with it, it'll start to spiral down instead of what we want to see, which is to go on a path toward greater strength.
We talk about resiliency. What are the warning signs of PTSD that our viewers should be aware of in their own presence and outside of that as well?
Absolutely. The first ones are physical. I want them paying attention to their sleep patterns. Are you able to sleep like you did before the critical event, before the trauma? Is your sleep pattern about the same? Is your appetite about the same? Do you have the same amount of energy as you did before? Are you waking up with very traumatic dreams? Are you reliving the event? Can you not stop thinking about the event, those intrusive memories? In fact, there's a list, Greg, that I'm sure you all will make available. These are the warning signs, and eventually it will lead toward a person feeling so despondent and so depressed that they will become self-destructive. And the dangerous part is if it's not caught, because some people are very quiet with those self-destructive things, eventually they will become suicidal. And tragically, some people will even try to take their own lives.
What is PTG and how is that different than PTSD?
Boy, I'm so glad you asked that question. PTSD we've all heard about. and I don't think that we know enough about, and we certainly don't treat it seriously enough. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a downward path after a time of trauma. But watch this. The other path, the upward path, is post-traumatic growth. That's the path toward resiliency. Post-traumatic growth is a series of steps where a person is taking care of themselves, or they've got a supportive environment around them to be able to get them through a tough time. There's a process I learned. Actually, I learned it from a chaplain on the pile at Ground Zero in New York City after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And I was trying to do everything to take care of everybody else. And he pulled me aside after almost 3 days with no sleep. And he said, "You're going to burn out." And he taught me a principle that was so powerful. He said, "You're doing this backward. You're taking care of everybody else, and then you're sort of paying attention to your team, and you're ignoring yourself." He said, "Here's what I want you to do. Number one is self-care, and then buddy care, and then other care." I said, "Self-care, what do you mean?" Because that was kind of a new concept to me back then. He said, "It's sort of like on the airplane when they say, if the cabin depressurizes, you put this mask on yourself first. And then with your mask on, taking care of you, you can help the next person. But if you don't take care of you, you're going to burn out, and then you can't take care of anybody." Remember the principle: self-care and then buddy care. Buddy would be my friends, my family, my coworkers. Are they okay? And then I take care of other people in the community or other people I may come in contact with. If you can remember that principle, self-care, buddy care, and then other care, you're on the path toward post-traumatic growth and resiliency.
Up next with Dwight Bain, we'll talk more about self-care and also caring for friends and family. What's our next step towards resiliency and healing here in Orlando? That and much more next. Welcome back to Central Florida Spotlight. Now back with Dwight Bain, a local counselor who deals with people that are dealing with more than they have in their life. And I think all of us, whether we knew somebody or didn't, have been impacted by what happened at Pulse.
Everybody's impacted. They're just impacted in different ways. So if you can think like an epicenter, right? So here is where the earthquake happened, and then it ripples out. The people in downtown Orlando, people that had friends and family who were shot, injured, killed, or who had friends or family, right? So they're in that epicenter. First responders are right there. Police, fire, medical. And then also the medical team at ORMC and Orlando Health did a phenomenal job of just saving lives for days, right? So here's epicenter. And then I work my way out. Everybody's impacted. They're impacted in a different way. Every human has stress in their life. But when something traumatic happens, it breaks our ability of equilibrium. It breaks our ability to cope and to function in a normal, healthy way. Everybody has stress, but traumatic stress is different, and it impacts the brain differently. And so when we see somebody who's feeling overwhelmed, whether it's a year later or a week later, remember the principle. If you talk through it, you can get through it.
So the strategies, talking through it, getting through it, what other things can people do to confront a difficult period, like what's going to be reminded to us on the 12th of June, which is a week from now?
Exactly. I want to remember 3 R's. Number one is rest. You have to take care of yourself and rest to be refreshed, to not be so stressed. If you know a stressful time is coming, you don't go into it exhausted. Number two is routines. After Hurricane Katrina, helping people in FEMA communities, mobile homes, and just trying to get them back stable after a major disaster. They'd lost their homes. I learned the importance of routines. Get up about the same time, go to bed about the same time, tuck your kids into bed and say prayers about the same time. Keep the routines about the same, because that will help your brain get back to that normal functioning pattern. The third part, they're all three important. The third part is relationships. Be around safe people. Try to avoid toxic people. And that means being able to pay attention to who do I know is supportive of me, or who do I know that needs support. Sometimes me sharing my story of what happened to our family when we went through the tragedy, and you sharing your story, helps both of us to be able to grow through it and be stronger.
All right, so you mentioned 9/11. You were at Ground Zero. You were also there for Columbine, Sandy Hook, and now in our own backyard. What can we learn from those other communities and those other people who have dealt with something like this?
It's a great question, and I would say hashtag Orlando Strong, hashtag Orlando United. In some communities, not all, but in some, Greg, a year later, it's like nobody remembered what happened. And what they do is they take, instead of talking about the tragedy, they hold it all inside. Yes, that happened. We don't like to talk about it here. That won't work anymore. Psychologically, you just can't do that. And so to be able to say, Orlando United, if you're not familiar with the hashtag, it's a little sign on social media, but it's the idea of saying, Orlando strong. How can we help each other through this?
I must end with this as a parent, and I know you're a parent and so many parents are watching. How do we deal with our kids this week? Some say, I'm just going to watch TV. I'm not going to go by there. I'm going to ignore it. What is your advice to parents?
I'm never going to question a parent, but if I was asked, I would say, look at your child. You know your child better than anybody. So look at your child, look at what your child is able to manage and handle. And that's not based on physical age, it's based on psychological age. If a person lost a friend or a family member, to ignore it, I do not believe is healthy. We talk about loss as a part of life. We talk about the grieving process as a part of life. However, if a family said, we didn't know anybody, we're not involved, we live in Sumter County, we sort of know about it, but we weren't that affected, then they're not going to have communication about it. But when crisis comes to their community, go to the prayer vigils, be involved in support, make meals, write letters to firefighters. The more we're involved in giving back, the more we're able to not only support the community, but it helps me get stronger to be able to know I'm part of something. I'm not on this planet alone. I don't live in the city alone. I'm involved in making a difference.
And on that note, very good note to end on, we'll wrap up this week's edition of Central Florida Spotlight. Thanks to Dwight Bain for explaining some of the emotions we're all feeling as the one-year mark of the pulse attack approaches. His guidance and advice are invaluable. Hope you took away something from his words. Join us again next week for another edition of Central Florida Spotlight. Until then, have a great remainder of your weekend and take care.